Let's take a look at how we would build the following workflow within Automation Anywhere. An employee wants to submit an invoice to their manager for approval. The manager will either deny that invoice, in which case the employee will be notified, or they will approve the invoice, again, in which case the employee will be notified. If approved, then the invoice moves on to a completely new processing workflow where we extract data from the document. And once data has been extracted from the document, we can key it into the finance system. So let's quickly go through this example. Here we are within the Automation Anywhere control room, and the first thing I'm going to do is create a form for my employee to submit the expense. And it's just a matter of dragging controls from the left here onto the blank form. So the first control I want is a drop-down list, which will give me the different expense type codes to use. And then I'm going to want to put on a expense amount here, or the claim amount. Next, I want my employee to be able to send a copy of the invoice or the receipt that they have. So I'm going to want a file control, but before that, actually, I'm going to want to put in a text area control where they can type in a description of what the expense was for. And that's everything I need on my form here. I'll give the form a title. Note that I can also set form rules. Now this is for conditional display of fields that are enabled, disabled, depending on actions that the user takes within the form itself. So we don't actually need any of those here. So let's create a second form for our workflow where the manager will approve the expense or review the expense. And here we have it already pre-created. I'm going to display the employee name and email, which come from the environment that can be picked up from metadata. The expense type, claim amount, and explanation, along with the document that has been attached, will be displayed here. Those are coming from the previous step where the employee submitted the data via the form, and that can then be reviewed by the manager in order to make a decision on the expense. Note there is also the ability to set field attributes here, like making a field required, making it uneditable, and so on. So in fact, given this is just a review form, I'm going to flag all of these fields as not editable, and the manager will just need to read these when approving or denying the expense. The next thing I want to do is create a process that I can use to define all of these steps involved. So we create a process from the control room, and the first starting step here is going to be a form submission by the employee, and I select the expense submit form that we previously created. Now the employee will see multiple requests that they've made in their in tray, so we want them to be able to distinguish one from another. So I'm going to feed in here a variable that they submit, being in this case the claim, so that they can tell different claims apart. We could use any of the data there if we needed to. The next thing I do is drag one of the building blocks from the left-hand side here onto the workflow. So we're going to use an approval step. Now within the approval, I give that step a name, and then I can configure whether that request is coming from an individual or coming from a group. And I can configure whether the approval needs to be given by an individual or by a group. So in this case, I'll leave it as a group, and we'll select a particular group from those configured within our CoPilot Automation Anywhere platform. We then select the form they're going to be using for this approval step. And I'll leave that defaulting with the approve and decline buttons there, which we could rename or change. And note that the fields of that form default here in our configuration. For my document, I'm going to pick that up from the request submitted by the employee. For the employee name, I'm actually going to pick that up from metadata that's stored with the request. And the same goes for the employee email. My expense type, claim amount, and explanation are also coming from the submitted data. So let's run a test of our logic. If I click on run, it executes in developer mode. I can select my expense type from the drop down here and fill in the rest of my form. I can select a file from some samples I have here, and as I do, that's uploaded to the server. Now when I submit, typically that would go off into the groups queue where it would be approved, but because I'm running it in developer mode here, I get to perform each step myself. So the manager would typically look at the data that's been submitted here, look at the invoice itself, choose what they want to do, and in this case, let's assume they decline. So let's look at the remaining steps that we need to perform to complete our workflow here. I need to make a decision based on whether the manager has approved or denied. So I drag across a if condition, and I'm going to be looking at the metadata of the approval step, in particular the status. So now the status will hold whether approved or declined was clicked. So that's everything I need there. And next, if it has been approved, then I'm going to run a bot to notify the employee. So we'll give that step a name. I select my particular automation, which is to send a notification here, and I would fill in the necessary details here in relation to notifying them. Now I'll also run the same bot if it has been declined. And in this case, I would simply feed in different values here that enable the same automation to serve two purposes. Next, for the approval flow, when it has been approved, I'm going to run another workflow, which is a document extraction workflow here, my employee data extraction, and that will take us through the process of extracting data from that document so it can be entered into our finance system. And then finally, I'm going to call a bot to perform some data entry, and I have an existing bot I've created here to enter that data into the finance system. So as you can see, our process designer allows us to build quite a sophisticated workflow by assembling the steps from existing building blocks and from existing automations within our control room. So let's see how we can put workflows like this at the fingertips of our employees. Note here within Teams, I have an Automation Anywhere tab within one of my Teams chats, and by clicking on this, I can access a range of workflows. This widget provides me with all of the workflows that I have access to, and that could include something like the expense claim workflow, which we just built. Here you can see a workflow which allows you to recommend an employee for a monthly award. These CoPilot widgets can be embedded into any web-based application. In this case, you can see within Salesforce in the case form, we have a range of workflows related to cases, which the employee can trigger, in this case, to reallocate a case to someone else. Note how data can also be pre-populated into the form from Salesforce itself, providing very tight integration.